full committee staff. Please keep your video function on at all times, even when you're not recognized by the chair. Members are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves, and please remember to mute yourself after you finish speaking. Consistent with the House rules, staff will only mute members and witnesses as appropriate when they are not under recognition to eliminate background noise. I'll now pause till we arrive at a quorum.
Testing.
I see that we have a quorum present now, and I'll recognize myself for opening remarks. Pursuant to notice, we are holding a hearing today entitled Accountability for Atrocity Crimes Committed by Russia in Ukraine. Good afternoon, and thank you all. Thank you for your patience as we had to go through some roll call votes, something that Prosecutor General used to know about in his former life. And thank you all for attending today's hearing on atrocity crimes committed in Ukraine by the Russian military. It's critical that we keep the brightest of spotlights on this issue to ensure accountability at all levels and to deter further Russian actions as the war continues. Since this is the third such hearing we've held in this subcommittee, I hope that the continued attention to the issue that we bring will help bring Russian war criminals to justice and provide the U.S. government and our allies with the political mandate they need to continue to do everything in their power to assist the Ukrainian people. This approach to war crimes investigations and the ongoing real-time documentation of war crimes is truly historic. It's occurring with the help of new technologies and multi-level coordination between military, civilian entities, as well as journalists on the ground. Today, sadly, marks the 210th day since Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and as the war continues, reports of Russian atrocities committed in Ukraine continue to accumulate. As the front line has shifted from northern Ukraine to southern and eastern Ukraine, Russian military tactics have increasingly targeted civilians, bombarding civilian areas with artillery rounds and using primarily unguided, dumb munitions, which devastate civilian infrastructure. As a result of the Russians' heinous crimes, millions of Ukrainians have either fled to Western Europe or have left to internally displaced areas within Ukraine. In addition, the U.S. government also estimates that Russia has deported between 900,000 and 1.6 million Ukrainian citizens, including 260,000 children. to at least 18 camps, often located in isolated regions in Siberia and the Far East. These individuals have been separated from family members, interrogated about their political beliefs, tortured, and forced to surrender their Ukrainian passports and accept new Russian passports. At the same time, as Ukrainian soldiers have liberated cities previously occupied by Russia across Ukraine, they've discovered mounting evidence of war crimes committed in those places. This includes the rape and sexual assault of young boys and girls, as well as the forced removal of children and infants from their mothers and from their families. For example, in the early days of the war, when the suburbs of Kyiv and Bucha were recovered, the world was shocked to first learn the full extent of the war crimes committed by Russian soldiers in these regions. Later, in Mariupol, Ukrainian liberators discovered that the Russian military had left a city formerly occupied by 430,000 inhabitants, 90% now uninhabitable. Most recently, as Ukraine has retaken territory to the east, Ukrainian soldiers discovered a series of mass graves in the city of Izium. So far, investigators estimate that around 500 soldiers and civilians alike are buried in mass graves in Izium, with many soldiers found shot with signs of torture and their hands tied behind their backs. Today, reports of atrocity crimes in Ukraine totals upwards of 35,000, with the United Nations estimating that Putin's war has killed over 5,500 civilians since February of this year. These are not random or isolated acts of violence, and I'm afraid as the days go on, investigators will find more mass graves and further evidence of atrocity crimes committed by the Russian military. It's clear that these crimes are systematic, deliberate, and they attempt to commit genocide against the Ukrainian people. Recent actions taken by the Kremlin indicate that Putin is only becoming more desperate. Last month, Putin asked Wagner executive Yevgeny Prigozhin with recruiting new soldiers from high-security Russian prisons. And just this morning, Putin made an announcement that many believe to be the next attempted annexation of Ukrainian territory, initiating partial mobilization of 300,000 additional Russian troops. In the speech, he also alluded to the potential use of nuclear weapons and forced sham referendums in a craven attempt to justify his unbridled aggression. The Western world needs to take notice of these decisions and take note very seriously. They're a public acknowledgement that Putin has failed in his so-called special operation in Ukraine. And we know that Putin would only institute a draft if he felt he had no other choice. Russians know that today, every one-way ticket out of Russia to the few countries still granting Russians visa access is sold out. So let me be clear. The Ukrainian people are suffering under a desperate and undeniably inhuman military assault, while Putin loses a war from the safety of one of his many palaces. As a result, Ukrainian citizens are being massacred by the thousand, and Russian soldiers are being sent to die in a senseless war, fueled by one megalomaniac that has only brought shame and instability to his country. Ukraine has fought with determination and bravery. It is imperative that Ukraine win their fight for freedom, independence, and a democratic way of life. And it's imperative that the U.S. government has and continues to do everything in our power to ensure that Ukraine can continue to gain ground on the battlefield while seeking justice in the courtroom. Every member of the Russian government who has supported this brutal war and every member of the Russian military who has committed a war crime in Ukraine must be held accountable. To support the fight for justice, the ranking member and I have brought together a distinguished group of witnesses to testify in the need for continued support of Ukraine, as well as to shed light on atrocity crimes committed by the Russian military. Together, they will detail efforts already undertaken by Ukraine, the U.S. government, the international community at large to achieve accountability for war crimes committed in Ukraine, as well as the support needed to continue this fight. I want to thank all of you for your commitment to the truth and your work to ensure justice for Ukraine. We really appreciate your being here today and look forward to your testimony. I will now turn to the ranking member for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank Chairman Keating for his support for Ukraine. Ukraine and the Ukrainian people have strong bipartisan support in this Congress. You have strong bipartisan support across the United States of America. And you are friends, and we will have your back, and you just know that to start. As the chairman indicated yesterday, Vladimir Putin, in his most recent of reckless comments, threatened tactical nuclear weapons. If we needed any more, as if this conflict didn't need any more escalation. This conflict so far has cost, at least reported, over 14,000 deaths, with over 5,000 being civilian deaths. And the majority of these civilian deaths have been from increasing and indiscriminate shelling and strikes. And over 1,000 civilians have been killed in attacks at a close range. Let us also not forget that the Russians have deliberately targeted and destroyed an operating maternity ward with infants inside, as well as a pediatric cancer hospital. This committee has held multiple hearings on war crimes and atrocities in Russia, and we will continue to do so to keep this in the spotlight so that war fatigue never sets in, so that the Congress and our colleagues never forget Ukraine and understand our responsibility to Ukraine with every successive aid package that comes forward. And moreover, as the Committee of Jurisdiction on this issue, we must know or be able to report to the Americans that their dollars are being wisely spent and the resources are getting precisely to where they need to get to. I just want to end where I started. Strong bipartisan support for your people, for your nation. As you all know, my last FBI assignment was in Ukraine. I lived there. I have a close connection to your people, to your government, and to your cause for freedom. And it's a reminder to everybody here in the United States, our democracy is also young. It's 246 years old. Ukraine's 30, 31. And you're under assault right now. And that can happen anywhere. And if freedom-loving nations don't support and back up and defend other freedom-loving nations, it sends a wrong message across the world, which is why it is very, very important that we uncover, report, and hold accountable anybody in the Russian regime responsible for war crimes and atrocities and the genocide that is ongoing to this day. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the ranking member for his testimony and his support and his personal commitment to this effort, which is ongoing and dates back to his actual work in Ukraine. I'll now introduce our witnesses, and I thank you again for being here. Our first witness is joining us virtually online, and that is Ms. Oleksandra Matviichuk, and she is the head of the board of the Center for Civil Liberties, a human rights organization focused on the OSCE region. Ms. Matviichuk, are you online with us right now?
Thank you very much for providing me a floor.
I now recognize you for 5 minutes, if I could, for your testimony.
Thank you very much for providing me a floor. I'm a human rights lawyer, and for over 20 years, I have been defending human rights in Ukraine and OSCE region. The recent 8 years, I have been documenting war crimes. Since Russian full-scale invasion, we have united dozens of organizations into the Tribunal for Putin initiative. Only in 7 months of Russian aggression, jointly, we have documented over 18,000 episodes of war crimes. And this is the reason why I can confidently assert the following. First, Russia uses war crimes as the methods of warfare. Russia attempts to break people's resistance and occupy Ukraine by means of what I call the immense pain of civilian people. A week ago, Ukraine liberated part of the occupied territories. Just like in Bucha in the Kiev region, now in the small town of Izum in the Kharkiv region, torture chambers and mass burials of the murdered were found. The whole families were killed there. Several generations of the Stolpakov family died in Izum. 33-year-old Dmitro, his wife Olena, their daughters who were 5 and 8 years old, as well as their grandparents and their mother's younger sisters. And this is a conscious policy of the Russian leadership. Russian military intentionally ruins residential dwellings, churches, hospitals, schools, critical civil infrastructure. They apply indiscriminate weapons in the densely populated areas. Russians facilitate filtration camps system and commit massive deportation of Ukrainian population. Russian army terrorized civilians, aiming to keep its control over the occupied territories. They intentionally exterminate local active people like mayors, journalists, activists, volunteers, priests, and others. Second, this situation in Ukraine is a consequence of impunity for the previous crimes which Putin's regime committed. For decades, Russian military have been committing war crimes in Moldova, Georgia, Syria, Mali, Libya, and other countries, and they have never been held accountable for this. Russians are convinced that they are free to do anything they want. I have interviewed more than hundreds of civilians who survived in Russian captivity, and they told me the horrible stories, how they had been beaten, raped, caged in wooden boxes, their limbs had been cut off, electricity went throughout their genitals. One woman told me how her eyes were put out with a spoon. Third, the national legal system of Ukraine is facing a difficult challenge. The Office of Prosecutor General has opened several dozens, thousands of criminal proceedings. And it's clear that even the world's most powerful legal system wouldn't be able to cope with such a great numbers of crimes during the war. Unfortunately, we cannot lord this task over the International Criminal Court. The ICC focuses only at the top officials and limits itself only to several selected cases. Investigation of the rest remains within the responsibility of Ukrainian investigative and court authorities. Thus, there appears an extremely acute question: how we can ensure justice for numerous thousands of war crimes victims. We have a chance to break this impunity circle of lasting for decades war crimes committed by Russia. And to achieve this, first, Ukraine requires long-range weapons in a sufficient amount. Currently, the entire UN system is unable to stop these atrocities. Russian military will continue to kill and torture unarmed. Second, Ukraine requires assistance to investigate and hold accountable for war crimes. The United States of America and the other countries could alter the legislation and take required decisions to assist to preserve evidence, protect war crime witnesses, to efficiently investigate the activity of suspected Russian war criminals. And third, the world should win this war in the dimension of value. This is not the war of two countries. This is the war of two systems, authoritarianism and democracy. And Putin is attempting to convince that freedom, democracy, and rule of law are the fake values, and they are unable to protect anyone. We will win this war in the dimension of value when we establish the International Tribunal to hold Putin and other Russian war criminals accountable. Thank you.
Our next witness, and I want to thank you for making the journey here and your commitment that you show from your presence here today, is Mr. Andriy Kostin. He is the Prosecutor General of Ukraine and tasked with processing thousands of possible war crimes committed by Russians against Ukrainians. And thank you for your efforts, and you're recognized for your initial testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Keating, Ranking Member Fitzpatrick, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. I greatly appreciate this opportunity to appear before you today to testify on the topic of accountability for atrocity crimes committed by Russia in Ukraine. At the outset, I wish to convey my sincere gratefulness to the United States, its government and people for your unwavering and crucial political, security, and financial support of Ukraine. Since 2014, Ukraine is fighting for its territorial integrity and lives of its people. From February 24th, 2022, 211 days have passed since unprecedented, full-fledged military aggression, kinds of which Europe has not experienced after the Second World War. This is not a simple war. By choosing this path, Russia has challenged the current world order. Russia has reverted to tactics of violence and terror. Daily, they are inflicting unimaginable suffering to Ukrainians and destroying civilian and critical infrastructure. This is done to break the resistance of Ukraine and affect its future as prosperous and democratic state. In these circumstances, state institutions of Ukraine are still functioning steadily. All law enforcement agencies are diligently implementing their functions and upholding law and order. To date, we are investigating over 32,000 instances of war crimes, which include indiscriminate shelling, premeditated murders, torture, rape, looting, forced deportation, etc. These crimes have resulted in the death of over 7,000 people, including 380 children. This number excludes casualties in occupied territories like in Mariupol, where we do not have access. Estimated number of casualties in these territories is assessed by tens of thousands. As a result of our actions, we already have 158 individuals charged as suspects and 9 convicted for war crimes. With the recent liberation by Ukrainian army of eastern and southern territories, we are discovering residues of further hideous crimes, so our docket is getting heavier. Let us remember atrocious nature of Russia's military action. Mass killings and torture in Bucha and other towns of Kyiv region. Bombing of Mariupol Maternity Hospital. Bombing of Mariupol Drama Theater. Shelling of Kramatorsk railway station. Strike on a railway station in Chapline. Bombing of a shopping center and supermarket in Kremenchuk. Attack on a Lenivka camp where Ukrainian prisoners of war were located. And finally, over 450 mass graves discovered in Izium, Kharkiv region with signs of torture and limbs and heads detached. I'm confident you all have seen tragic photos from Mariupol. Currently, we have just 5 cases in relation to crimes committed in Mariupol. You might ask, why is this the case? The answer is simple. The city is still under Russian occupation. We cannot determine the extent of crimes or a number of victims and hold perpetrators accountable unless we enter the city. And Mariupol is not the only city in this situation. And the only way to achieve accountability is by taking back these territories. And for this, we require weaponry. Here, the logic is simple. With arms, we will achieve the victory, which will further pave the way to accountability. Atrocities started as a result of aggression. Therefore, it is paramount that Russia is held accountable for this crime as well. Due to jurisdictional constraints, the International Criminal Court is barred from its investigation. Therefore, the creation of special international tribunal to investigate and punish the crime of aggression is essential for Ukraine. we need to send a clear message that a blatant violation of international law shall not be allowed anymore. Daily, the war is causing tremendous human and material damage to Ukraine and Ukrainians. Rebuilding of our country will be painstaking and costly. Therefore, we need to establish a sound legal mechanism for compensation for full and effective reparation of harm caused by Russia. Finally, on a separate note, I would like to underscore that we also highly appreciate efforts of designating Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism. Sowing terror and chaos are modus operandi of Russia, and this war shows this. I wish to conclude by underscoring that Ukraine has shown its readiness and capacity to investigate and prosecute international crimes. It's, however, our common responsibility to put an end to the syndrome of impunity. Architects of Russia's political and military policy have been way too long getting away from their blatant disregard of international law. We should resort to all avenues to enforce accountability for those who orchestrated and enabled commission of crimes, and to provide measure of justice to victims. And in this, we count on your support. Thank you.
Our next witness is Ambassador Clint Williamson. He's the lead advisor heading the joint EU-UK-US Atrocity Crimes Advisory Group for Ukraine. He's also the senior coordinator for international justice at Georgetown University. Thank you for being here, Ambassador. Now I recognize you for your opening statement.
Thank you. Chairman Keating, Ranking Member Fitzpatrick, distinguished members of the committee. It's an honor to join you today and to speak with you about the situation in Ukraine. Particularly privileged to appear here with Andriy Kostin, Prosecutor General, with whom I work very closely. For almost 30 years, I've been engaged in efforts to further accountability for perpetrators of atrocity crimes around the world, going back to my deployment to the newly created International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia in May 1994. Since then, I've worked in a variety of roles in the U.S. government, the United Nations, and the European Union, including service as U.S. Ambassador at Large for War Crimes issues during the Bush and Obama administrations. Although my engagement on atrocity crime issues commenced with my posting to the ICTY, my work in ensuing years has been global in scope. My formative years in the field, however, were focused on the former Yugoslavia, and to bookend that experience, my last posting with the Department of State was to the European Union, where I served as the EU Special Prosecutor, examining crimes that were perpetrated in the aftermath of the 1999 war in Kosovo. I can honestly say that when I left that post, I never imagined that I would be doing this type of work in Europe again. While the 20th century was the bloodiest and most brutal that any continent has suffered in the history of the world, in the 23 years since the end of the Balkan Wars, we've seen a Europe that has become far more integrated politically, economically, and culturally. So it was surreal and chilling to see Vladimir Putin in the year 2022 using the same tactics that Adolf Hitler used to prepare the ground for his absorption of the Sudetenland in 1938, or that Slobodan Milosevic employed to justify Serbian aggression in Croatia and Bosnia. By early this year, I had already been working for months with the Office of the Prosecutor General of Ukraine to assist them in their handling of atrocity crimes that had occurred since 2014. As the Russian invasion appeared more imminent in January, I began working on contingency plans with the State Department to shift our work to a more operational, hands-on approach that could offer immediate, real-time assistance to the Ukrainian authorities if Russia did invade. When I received an urgent call from the Prosecutor General's office on February 23rd, they clearly recognized at that point that an invasion was going to happen and asked if I could come with a small team of experts to assist them with the incredible challenges they knew they would soon be facing. As we all know, the invasion did take place the following day, and for 2 days thereafter, I lost contact with my Ukrainian counterparts. When they reemerged and contacted me, we quickly made arrangements to go to the Polish border, just west of Lviv, and arrived there 8 days after the war began. Already the next day, we started meeting with the Office of the Prosecutor General, the OPG, and working with them on a number of issues. What struck me in those first conversations at the border was how determined the Ukrainian prosecutors were to get this right, and how clear-headed they were in assessing the challenges they faced. At that point, Russian forces were bearing down on Kyiv, and the outcome of the invasion was very much in question. Yet the Ukrainian prosecutors, like most of their countrymen, were defiant and absolutely convinced, even at this early date, that defeat was not a possibility. They were already committed in these early days to holding those who perpetrated crimes on either side accountable for their actions. Since that initial deployment, the plans we made with the State Department have led to the establishment of the Atrocity Crimes Advisory Group. This started as a solely U.S. initiative, but it quickly garnered support from our international partners, and both the European Union and the United Kingdom joined the effort. It was officially rolled out to the global community in a joint statement by Secretary of State Blinken and his EU and UK counterparts on May 25th. And why is it so important that we assist the Ukrainians as they pursue these prosecutions? Obviously, there are strong national interest in deterring naked aggression, in standing up for rule of law, and in helping ensure a peaceful and secure Europe. Yet there's another factor at play here as well, and it's one that makes the situation in Ukraine different from almost any scenario I've worked in over the last 30 years. The more common scenario has been in places like Syria or Myanmar, where national authorities have been resistant to any accountability efforts because they themselves are complicit in crimes. In Ukraine, though, we have a democratically elected government with legitimate law enforcement and judicial authorities, and with the capacity and will to investigate and prosecute crimes occurring on its national territory. So it is important that we support them in this task. It's also important that we support viable international justice efforts in Ukraine, which rest primarily with the International Criminal Court. But the ICC has limits on how many cases it can bring, so every perpetrator who falls under that threshold level of ICC prosecutions will have to be dealt with by the Ukrainian authorities, and these cases could number in the thousands. The task, then, that the OPG faces is monumental. Under the circumstances, Prosecutor General Kostin and his office have done a phenomenal job, and it has been a privilege to work with them. We have to recognize, though, that their work will go on for years, not months, and it's critical that we sustain our support to them and help as they try to deliver a degree of justice to the victims of Russian aggression in Ukraine. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the witnesses for their opening testimony and the distinction of how this truly is a unique investigation and historic, actually, in nature. We can't think of another time when the investigation is going on real time with the cooperation of a democratic, as Ambassador Williamson mentioned, a democratic country governed by the rule of law, and how important that is, as well as the commitment, both on the civilian, military, and journalistic side, to come to the truth. I now recognize members for 5 minutes each, and pursuant to House rules, all time yielded is for the purposes of questioning our witnesses. I'll recognize members by committee seniority, alternating between Democrats and Republicans. If you miss your turn, please let our staff know, and we'll circle back to you. If you seek recognition, you must unmute your microphone and address the chair verbally. I will begin starting by recognizing myself for 5 minutes, but before I do, I would like unanimous consent to submit a report into the record from Amnesty International documenting cases of Russian war crimes. It's also worth noting that Daniel Balson from Amnesty, who wrote the statement of evidence, is here with us in the audience. Without objection, so moved. I'd like to ask our witnesses, I mean, there's so much to talk about, the horrors, the atrocities, but I want to begin by asking them to describe even more about how children are being placed in camps. I don't even like the term filtration camp. It doesn't do justice to what is going on there. How they're forcibly removed and deported from their homes and sent to Russia. I'd like to ask all of you to just comment further on what is truly one of the most troubling aspects of all these crimes.
It's really a difficult question, how they have been replaced. First of all, because the territory was occupied by Russians. The territory was under their control. They cut any possible source of connection. And these people which appeared on this occupied territory, they have no possibility to reach any source of information, telephone, internet. And then the aggressor started to put pressure to frighten them. And then many of them were just forcibly taken and sent away. And many of them were relocated. They didn't understand where they are located to, because Russians could tell the different story. They could even explain that these people will be, they could ask them where you want to go. And if they even explained that we would like to come to Ukrainian controlled territory, they could say okay, and then put them to some vehicle and then transport to the other place. What was going on then on the territory which is not controlled by us and which is very difficult to access even by means of our intelligence, say like this, it's quite difficult to find out. The only witnesses we have is from people and children which we returned. As of today, we can confirm not more than 55 children which returned from Russia. Only this amount.
Of how many?
Only this number.
Of how many would you say?
In the Office of Prosecutor General, at the moment, we identified more than 5.5 thousand children which were deported or kidnapped. We have evidence of 7,000 children which were kidnapped. We understand and believe that the amount which you mentioned and which is hundreds of thousands of children deported could be the real amount. Though we in our office, we can rely only on written evidences which we have in our possession.
So it's a small percentage that you've been able to document. And if you're having this much trouble contacting these, what about their mothers? What about their families? It must be nearly impossible for them to.
It's different stories. Most of them were deported together with their relatives. But the most severe stories are about orphans, which were deported, and then we have information that they are adopted by Russian citizens, which means that any possible documents about their previous real origin and life would be destroyed.
And what are the age groups of these children, would you say?
Sorry?
What were some of the younger ages of these children?
The younger,
ranging
different.
from how young?
How young? Different age. They are the youngest as well, so before 7 years old.
So they may not have much of a memory of their other life.
So this is a real problem, and we can treat this as an act of genocide, because kidnapping hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian children means stealing the future of Ukrainian nation. And we can treat this act as an act of genocide, especially when they keep secret on, they don't do it openly. That is why we have a discussion about the number of children which were deported, because they keep it secret. They don't want to disclose this, because they understand probably that they violate the law.
Wow. Thank you so
If
much.
I may
I now, well, perhaps this will come up with Ms. Matviichuk. Maybe you'll have the opportunity with other members to expand on that, but my time has expired and I yield to the ranking member. But I believe you'll have an opportunity to expand on that, Ms. Matviichuk.
Thank you very much. I would like to make several points on this issue. First, we don't know the number, but the scale of the problem is very huge. And we have the several groups of the children which we are speaking about. The first, children who were forcibly deported with their families from the Ukraine to Russia. Second, the children who were in a special orphans institution in Ukraine who was deported as a whole facilities to Russia. And third, the most non-investigating group is children whose parents were killed in this Russian invasion, and they became orphans, and then they were deported to Russia. The bright case is case of Kira Abidinskaya. She lost her mother before Russian invasion, but her father was killed in Mariupol during the Russian invasion. And then she forcibly was transferred to Russian Federation, and only because of assistance of Russian human rights defenders, this girl was returned home to their relatives. And this is a real problem because in May this year, Putin simplifies legislation and provide more opportunities for adoption of Ukrainian children. And we can have a situation when children who lost their parents in this war with Russia will be adopted, and we even have no idea how to find them in Russian Federation, and their relatives and the friends of their families who want to adopt them will have no possibility to do it. And last but not the least, we had testimonies of parents and children who returned from Russia after this forcible deportation, and they told about the process of cleansing identity of Ukrainian children, which provided by lessons and other kinds of activities with Ukrainian children. And this is clearly show the genocidal character of this war. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And now we didn't start the clock on you, so you're getting your full time, but I recognize the ranking member, and I thank very compelling answers to those questions, even raising to the point of genocide. So I recognize the ranking member. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. Mr. Kostin, just germane to my earlier comments about our need to sustain assistance to Ukraine so that Ukraine can keep performing the heroic acts that you all are. I was happy to hear President Zelensky mention, I believe it was in a CNN interview, about how they were tracking U.S. assistance, both military and humanitarian assistance. Can you share, just for the benefit of my colleagues, both here on the committee and colleagues that we're going to need to solicit support to maintain that level of assistance that Ukraine needs, what your office and the administration is doing to track assistance coming in and monitor it to make sure that it's not being siphoned through corruption or any other means?
Thank you. First of all, we have two ways of ensuring that any financial aid, any humanitarian aid is on the safe and is used properly. The first way is institutionary, and this, as you know, we are strengthening the anti-corruption infrastructure. The chair of the Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office is in place. the competition to appoint new director of National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine is ongoing. It will be started very shortly. I also took a decision to add 9 more positions of the prosecutors to the Office of Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office. My speech with the Parliament during my appointment was that Ukraine has 2 enemies: external enemy, which is Russia and its collaborators and traitors, which we find in Ukraine and make liable, and second is corruption, which we all need to fight constantly. So institutionally, everything is in place, and all of my addresses to all law enforcement agencies are constantly the same. We can't allow anyone to steal anything from the budget. We can't allow anyone to steal anything from humanitarian aid. And every week, once we have any case, my reaction is very strong. Second, on the level of government, it's, from my point of view, I don't see and I don't track any cases of big corruption or big cases of when something is reported about stealing money from budget or stealing humanitarian aid. What we understand are minor cases where we immediately react. And coming back to military support, no case about disappearing of any hard weapons we received from our partners.
Mr. Kostin, just to clarify, is it the NABU or the PG that has jurisdiction over monitoring U.S. assistance?
It depends on the amount and it depends on the authority. So we are working shoulder to shoulder with NABU and Special Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office. We have constant communication and we have absolutely same goal. So they do their job, we are doing our job. So because high-level corruption is within NABU and Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office, lower level is with law enforcement agencies under the umbrella of the Office of Prosecutor General.
Thank you, sir. I yield back.
Thank you.
Chair recognizes the Vice Chair of the committee, Representative Abigail Spanberger from Virginia, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. I appreciate your remarks in response to Ranking Member Fitzpatrick's question and the duality of foreign adversary and then the rooting out corruption, which I know has been a government priority well before the invasion. So I wanted to follow up in terms of the investigations that you all are working on. Could you just walk us through a little bit how that is structured, what you are able to do even in an active war situation, and what coordination, and perhaps this is for you, Mr. Ambassador, what coordination is most helpful and what else you would like to see from the United States Congress?
Thank you for your question. It's really a challenge when we are registering new and new incidents of war crimes every day. And it's a challenge to properly investigate and prosecute them all. Mm-hmm. So first is to prioritize our work. And we prioritize it with regard to the consequences of specific war crimes. So when we liberated Kharkiv region and the massive graves found in Izium of course, we prioritize our work and start to put additional resources in the Kharkiv region. Actually, Izium is not the only place. There are other places in Kharkiv region. I already mentioned that the territory liberated from the beginning of September is like the territory of state of Connecticut. It's very big. And in many of these cities, practically in all of them, in towns and villages, we have the examples of war crimes. So what we now do on the level of the prosecutor's office of the region, we have made joint investigative groups where prosecutor, investigator, police officer, expert, our foreign experts are also including in some of them, and they work on the ground in parallel in several towns and cities. And they report every day on what they have found. So this is our priority. For the crimes which committed before and which are now under investigation, our priority is to find out the perpetrator, because we have the fact, we have witnesses, we have victims, but we can't, in many cases, find the perpetrator. For this reason, we try to find these people by means of open source intelligence and analyzing big data of photo, video, internet materials.
And who's driving most of that aspect of the investigation? Are you all doing it, or is it in coordination with NGOs and other?
For these type of cases, it's in coordination with, first of all, with our international experts, because they have knowledge, they have expertise, and they have access to data. Mm-hmm. And of course, we are also coordinating our work with the NGOs. Actually, last week, I have gathered all of the NGOs with whom Office of Prosecutor General is in contact with regard to all the processes we are handling. Not only war crimes, but also cybersecurity, also conflict-related sexual violence crimes, the crimes against journalists, etc. So we have now constructed this work in 6 different directions with our cooperation with the NGOs and civil society. Yeah, sorry.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And their job is really very helpful. And for now, coming back to your question, the biggest need is, of course, the IT, because we need IT decisions, how to analyze huge amount of information, which is collected not only by us, but also by civil society organizations, in order to match the specific photo and video materials to a specific perpetrator, a specific criminal case. Mm-hmm. So we also need not only technical solutions, but of course servers with big amount of storage, in order not to lose the evidences we all collect.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back. Thank you.
Chair recognizes Representative Brian Mass from Florida.
I'm sorry,
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I suspect I know the answer to this before I even ask it, but I'd like to have the answer for the record. Can you tell me what cooperation, if any, you've had in reporting this to anybody on the Russian side?
I don't know about any cooperation with law enforcement from Russian side, so I don't think that we have something like this.
I would expect that would be the answer.
Sorry?
Can you tell me, with those that have become Russian prisoners of war, Russian prisoners to Ukraine, have you obtained any confessions from Russians that are now Ukrainian prisoners?
If I understand correctly, you are talking about Russians which are now prisoners of war in Ukraine, which are now in our possession. Am I right?
Correct. Correct.
Ukraine is the country which respects rule of law and international humanitarian law. So our treatment with prisoners of war from Russian Federation is lawful and is in line with all principles of international humanitarian law.
Have you received any confession from them?
Confession.
From any?
Yeah, how work is organized. So when we capture, not we of course, but our military capture the prisoners of war from Russia, we screen all of them. So we check all of them and try to talk to them and to take witness from them. Some of them, yes, they confess. Some of them not. And then we also screening them because we have a lot of database, big database for the war crimes committed prior on the occupied territory of Ukraine, for instance, in Kiev region, and we check all of them if they could be the criminals who committed these war crimes on the occupied territory. So this is the process which we do with every prisoner of war which is in our possession.
Do you hold Vladimir Putin responsible for these crimes?
Once again,
do you hold Vladimir Putin, President of Russia, responsible for these crimes?
we fully understand that the chain of command starts from Vladimir Putin and then go down to any soldier of Russian army.
What sentencing would you see held for Vladimir Putin?
You know that the only possible way to make the highest political leadership of Russia accountable for war crimes they committed is international tribunal, since they have immunity according to international law. This will be decided by international tribunal when it will be organized.
For any of the countries, Europe, any other countries outside of Europe like America, do you believe that any commerce should resume with Russia prior to war crime tribunals?
I just want to understand correctly your question. You mean that any business should stop business relations with Russia before the tribunal? Could you kindly explain one more time?
Yes, can I have the lead, Mr. Chairman, to continue that question?
I would just be mindful of the time. We're up against a roll call, and we have several members here. Perhaps that could be explored in writing later on, since there's a difficulty in communicating that. So the chair will recognize Representative Susan Weil from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Kostin, thank you for being here. The testimony you have given both here and in writing is very impactful and devastating, quite honestly. You, in your written testimony, mentioned that you have 158 individuals charged and 9 individuals convicted for war crimes. You've spoken to us about kidnapping and deportation of children, so let's just for the moment set aside that horror. Can you describe, or can you give us an overview of some of the cases that you have pending?
First of all, let me update the figure. It's up to date, as my colleagues told me. 167 individuals charged. So each day,
And still 9 convicted?
still 9 convicted. Yeah.
Okay. Just, can you give me a sampling of just a few of those
Yeah,
cases?
of those who are convicted. One person is convicted for murder of civilian, several for robbery of civilian during occupation, and several for torture, and several for unlawful detention.
Thank you. Have journalists, investigative journalists, been of assistance to you in investigating and documenting war crimes?
Yes, absolutely. And I would just mention that when we found this massive grave in Izum, we immediately, it's not only us as a Prosecutor General office, but together with all law enforcement agencies, we immediately organized more than 100 journalists to come and to see, and the exhumation of first bodies was in presence of journalists. So we didn't exhume these bodies before journalists come and have access to see and to report.
And what about the use by civilians of their personal devices, such as their phones? Has that also been a part of the investigative process?
Yes, absolutely. So we even try to inspire people who could be potential witnesses or victims of war crimes to share this information with us, and even ask our people who are now safely located abroad in Europe and who could be potential witnesses and victims of war crimes to report and even to share their photos and videos with our colleagues in European countries with whom we have special agreements signed, so that they can collect these evidences properly, and then we can use them in our criminal proceedings, and the International Criminal Court can use these evidences in proceedings we hope we start by the end of the year.
It sounds very organized, but it also sounds very time-consuming and complex, what you are describing. Yes.
Yes, that's true. But my position is that we can't. We have a unique chance to preserve these evidences, as Mr. Chairman pointed out in his opening remarks. It's really challenging. And we even started a communication strategy with the help of our American partners who finance this project to reach our people in Europe who are now in safe location, to inspire them to report about potential war crimes they have been witnessed or victims of. Because my fellow colleagues, prosecutors general of several European countries with whom I talked, they said that they are ready and they provide this opportunity, but they feel that some of our people are a little bit resistant. Maybe they are afraid. So we will start this communication from my name to our people who are now in safe place to report about the war crimes, and even just to share these photos and videos if they have them in their possession. This will help us.
Thank you very much. With that, I yield back.
Chair recognizes Representative Dan Muser from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it, and thank you both very much for, you're very hard to listen to, but glad to testimony. Our hearts go out to you and all the people of the Ukraine. So, Prosecutor General Kostin, has Ukraine declared war on Russia for their invasion of your country? Made a declaration of war?
Ukraine was attacked by Russian Federation, and Russia called it special
Right.
operation.
Yeah.
Ukraine has declared a war, state of war.
Okay, state of war. Does
Yes.
that change your
From legal point
prosecution?
of view, it's like
Okay.
means nothing. Yeah.
That's what I was
No
curious
change.
about.
Yeah.
Okay. Because it might, right? I mean, and perhaps it should, but that's a
I-
whole different story, according to your laws.
It's quite long legal
Yeah.
discussion. We don't think that it needs to
Okay.
be taken. If everyone understands that the
Right.
act of aggression was committed, we are just fighting.
Gotcha. All right, thank you. So on the arrests of and the POWs, have you gone through a trial and prosecution of some of them? You mentioned confessions, but has there been a trial? And has war crimes been deemed from that trial?
So you're asking about prisoners of war?
I'm asking about the prisoners that you have that you're accusing of war crimes, that have committed war crimes. Have you actually prosecuted them and brought them to trial?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
We have 26 cases now
Okay.
in court.
I see. And what do they, you said there were some confessions. What did they confess to actually, what they did, what was proven? Like all of these atrocities that we hear of? Or-
Usually, they
Yeah.
confess what they did. It's quite difficult to find out if their confession is 100%
Sure.
what they
Sure.
committed.
What was the highest
Many
rank?
of them confessed.
What was the highest rank officer that you've prosecuted?
Yes, we have one colonel, which is under prosecution
I
at the
see.
moment.
And is he going to get life imprisonment? I mean,
No,
is
he's not. He's
he
not.
sentenced yet?
He's not convicted yet.
Okay, he's not convicted yet. Has Russia reached out to you on any of these, or no?
Not through our.
Right.
Yes, not us directly. Of
Have
course.
any other countries arrested any of those individuals in high-ranking positions that are fleeing?
No, we have no information about it.
Okay. Now, the sanctions that we are issuing and the West and NATO has issued, they're probably never adequate in your view, and I don't blame you a bit. Are we seizing their assets? I mean, are we really sanctioning them to make their life miserable?
It's better to ask them if they feel their life is miserable. I feel that the sanctions was one of the strongest weapons
Right.
from the very first days.
Okay. And what countries are assisting you most?
United States,
Who's second?
UK,
Okay.
EU. I can't, count
Yeah,
in
yeah, okay.
figures.
Just
but
the top.
politically, yeah.
Good. Well, it's good to hear. And, okay, Ambassador, tribunals, models for such. Is the Ukraine model that's being exercised right now, is that appropriate? Is it something more like the Nuremberg trials? What are you thinking?
but recognizing that it's quite limited. And then you have domestic capabilities through the Ukrainian system. The Prosecutor General's office is very capable. The major challenge they have is just the scale of what they're dealing with. And frankly, this would be overwhelming for any system anywhere in the world. But they have a high degree of expertise. I think the assistance we've been able to bring from the international community has made a positive difference, particularly in working with regional prosecutors who have had less experience dealing with war crimes. But we are continuing to deploy experts with a lot of expertise from international tribunals to help with prosecutions, investigations, incorporating military analysis into prosecutions, and these sorts of things. And also trying to replicate what we're doing in Kyiv into field offices that will be opening in coming months.
Thank you. Slava Ukraine. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Chair recognizes Representative David Cicilline from Rhode Island.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses. Mr. Kostin, you know, we have seen reports of just really horrible images from Bucha and Irpin, for example, of, you know, men, women, and children with their hands tied behind their backs, shot to death, elder Ukrainians who were executed while they searched for food, civilians confined to frigid hiding places, dead from thirst, and reports of the partially burned bodies of women and girls who were victims of depraved acts of sexual violence. So you said there were 32,000 instances of war crimes that you've collected already. Can you just give us a general description of what most of those are? Are they in one particular category? Do they?
So most of the cases are related to destroying of civil objects. So people whose, flats, apartments, residential houses, or any other property is destroyed due to shelling, bombing, hitting by missiles. So this is the biggest number of the cases of war crimes, from this category. And for this, actually, I mentioned the help with IT instruments. We understand, we feel that some of these cases could be duplicated because different, relatives can report about the same property hit.
Right. But in terms of the collection of the evidence, is your local law enforcement agencies doing that? How are you collecting it? How are you storing it? It's an active battlefield in many ways. How are you securing what you're collecting, keeping it safe?
Actually, this work is more organized now than it was in first months of active war. So now we have, I don't know about any organizational problems about collecting and storing of evidences, if we are talking about material evidences in the regions where most of the war crimes now are committed. So most of war crimes at the moment is hitting and shelling of residential and civil infrastructure, like regions of Mykolaiv, Zaporizhia, Dnipropetrovsk region, Kharkiv. Kharkiv now is more safe thanks our army and God.
So in terms of the ways that the U.S. can support the work you're doing, because I think we all recognize accountability for this kind of horrific acts of violence is really critical. Do allies and others who are partners who are supporting the Ukrainian people and supporting this effort, are they sending counsel and investigators to help you in this work? Because 32,000 cases for no matter how well you're working, that's enormous amount of work. Do you have the U.S. and other governments that are sending you prosecutors and investigators to help collect this evidence and present these cases?
Yes, we received this support not only from US, UK, and EU, including some countries which are ready to send their people to work on the ground. Actually, with the Atrocity Crimes Advisory Group project, the additional facilities that the project receives at the moment will allow us to open the offices of the Atrocity Crimes Advisory Group in several regions of Ukraine, where the experts will work on the ground closer to the crime scenes we have at the moment. And of course, it's very important for my prosecutors and our experts to be safe when they work. Absolutely. That's why what we need, of course, it's special ammunition and special vehicles and special instruments for our prosecutors to be safe when they come close to the front line to collect evidences.
So, I think we would want to continue to hear from you and Ambassador Williamson on whatever we can do, be supportive of your work. And as the conditions on the ground change, I think you will have strong support on both sides of the aisle on this committee to do that. Ambassador Williamson, I want to ask you about one thing. I've introduced a piece of legislation, a bipartisan bill with Senator Durbin in the Senate, to expand U.S. jurisdiction over war crimes for people who leave the place they've committed the war crime if they end up in the United States under certain conditions, it would confer jurisdiction on the United States to prosecute them for those war crimes wherever they occurred. Would that be useful in this context to the extent any of these perpetrators get out of the battlefield and end up in the United States?
Yeah, Ambassador, if you could do this very briefly, because time has expired on this. So
Sure. Absolutely. It would be very helpful. The reality is that certainly most of the higher level Russian officials, either on the civilian side or military side, are not going to be in Ukraine. They're going to be in Moscow. But they do travel. They have yachts and villas in the south of France that they move around. So having the ability to go after these individuals as they end up in third countries is going to be critical to any sort of accountability process.
Thank you so much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Chair recognizes Representative Claudia Tenney from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all the witnesses. And our heart goes out to you. These are hard times, and it's a very difficult job that you're all trying to do. My questions, I'm going to first address my questions to Ambassador Williamson. They're a little bit more on the technical side. So we have all these international tribunals that are confusing with their jurisdictional ability. The International Court of Justice, that's between states. We have the International Criminal Court, which you mentioned has been somewhat useful in prosecuting individuals. I think it's fair to say that a lot of us would like to figure out how do we get Putin, because that could be the real stoppage of what the carnage is that we're seeing, not just in Ukraine, but what we've seen around. How do we get any kind of jurisdiction in that case? We have the problem of Russia, the Russian Federation being a permanent member of the UN Security Council, but how effective would be some of these tribunals in fact, in the case of, like you said, you were in Yugoslavia, Rwanda, what is the solution? How do we get jurisdiction over a Putin, and how does that happen?
Well, the International Criminal Court has jurisdiction in Ukraine. So fortunately in this case, unlike Syria where Russia continued to veto any referrals to the ICC, it's not an issue here. Ukraine had signed the Rome Treaty, but it was not ratified. But by invitation, they have had the ICC exercise jurisdiction since 2014. So the ICC is actively involved in their investigations there. They certainly have the ability to indict Putin or other senior Russian officials. And this is something that the Ukrainians have constraints on doing because of head of state of immunity and just under domestic law. So the ICC is really the best option there. The challenge ultimately, though, is going to be getting any of these individuals in custody. But there are, I think, some factors that argue in favor of ICC prosecutions over domestic ones for more senior officials.
Well, let me ask you this, if you don't mind 1 second. So you're saying that ICC is in Ukraine and they're a signatory. Is the Russian Federation a signatory?
Russia is not a signatory to the
Okay, so isn't that part of the problem in getting jurisdiction or being able to get the...
No, because the jurisdiction applies to states parties or to crimes that are individuals, perpetrators from states parties, or crimes that occur on the territory of states parties. So Ukraine as a signatory, and then by inviting the ICC to exercise jurisdiction, this gives the ICC jurisdiction over crimes that are committed in Ukraine.
Okay, so Russia need not be a signatory then in order to get jurisdiction over high-ranking Russian officials, including Putin, potentially?
That's correct.
So how would we get him to, what do you suggest? How do we get some of these high-ranking people to justice? I get they're hiding on yachts and they have lots of protection around the world because they have a lot of money. Yeah. But is there any way we were able to get high-ranking officials in a smaller country like Yugoslavia? What about with these high-ranking officials?
I think in the short term, it's quite unlikely. Certainly if there were a change to a more rule of law oriented government in Russia, this might make things possible. I led the investigation against Slobodan Milosevic for crimes in Kosovo in 1999. When we indicted him, we thought it was very unlikely that he would ever come into the custody of the Yugoslavia Tribunal. Just 2 years later, there was a change in government. He was surrendered and was ultimately tried. So it's not out of the realm of possibility, but again, I admit that it's quite unlikely. But what
Is
does
that something
happen,
you're considering? Is that something that the Ukrainian government and our international bodies are looking to do, or is this too much of a politically difficult issue in light of Russia's membership as a permanent member of the Security Council?
to do what? I'm sorry.
To get some of these top-level Russian officials?
Well, I think everyone would be very interested in getting them, but as long as they remain in Russia, there's no international police force that can go in and get them. So you're dependent on cooperation from Russia. Thus, the point I was making about a change in government. But what can happen with indictments from the ICC, it will certainly change the way in which these people live. It will become very difficult for Vladimir Putin or others to travel internationally, to play the role on the world stage that they're used to doing. I think it also bolsters the case of sanctions against them in maintaining these going forward. So there are some even short-term dividends that can be achieved even if they're not brought into custody.
So what you're saying, we should continue our sanctions push and everything that we can, at least
Absolutely.
ostensibly to put the pressure on.
Absolutely.
Thank you. I really appreciate the question.
Thank you.
I yield
Chair,
back.
the chair recognizes Representative Dina Titus from Nevada, who I believe has a question for Ms. Matviichuk.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Throughout the conflict, as Russia has tried to expand its territory in parts of Ukraine and move out to new areas, they've been met with a lot of resistance by civilians. They're patriots, they're brave. You see women with broomsticks, all of these folks who are civilians resisting this imperialism that Russia is doing. And what we've heard is in response, Russia has conducted arbitrary detentions, forced disappearances, interrogations, and widespread reprisal in other ways. They talked about filtration camps for interrogation. I wonder if your organization is working to document these crimes and if you're receiving any assistance from government or from us or from anybody to help you keep track of these kinds of atrocities?
Thank you very much for your question. We see that Russia used a deliberate policy of persecute local people in order to save control over the occupied region. And we see this practice since 2014. It started in Crimea, in the occupied part of Donetsk and Lugansk region. And what the difference after the large-scale invasion? When we speak about deliberate persecution, we speak about some groups of people who are in the risk, like representatives of local government, local authorities, active people like priests, volunteers, journalists, human rights defenders who have some reputation in their community. But after large-scale invasion, something changed, and this is something that Russia started to use not only deliberate persecution, but a terror against civilians. And this is very clearly seen when Bucha, Izum, Vorzel, Matizhin were liberated, because there is like no even cynical reason to fire at people on the street who just walking on the street or ride on the bicycle. So it were deliberate terror against civilians who increase the numbers of victims in the scale. And the filtration camp system is not also new, because for these 8 years, we see the practice of illegal place of detentions and in the occupied regions, where civilians were abducted, tortured, subjected to sexual violence, and killed. The most visible one is secret detention place is isolation in Donetsk. And when the famous Donetsk journalist Stanislav Aseyev was released, he wrote a book about the torture and horror which going on in this place. So now with this filtration system, Russians just multiplies this practice into the new occupied territories. And yes, we also documented such kind of crimes. And among 18,000 of episodes of war crimes which I mentioned, which was documented jointly by Tribunal for Putin Initiative, there is also such kind of examples.
Thank you very much. Just briefly, Ambassador Williamson, you mentioned in your written testimony that the number of people who have been taken across the border into Russia could be high as 1.6 million, including 260,000 children. Last time we saw this was World War II out of the Baltics. I wonder, does technology allow us to track these people? Do you have any way of contacting them or trying to get them back, or what's our policy on that?
Unfortunately, we don't have a solid way of tracking people. These numbers are derived from a variety of sources, but as Mr. Kostin said earlier, we just don't have visibility on what's going on in the occupied territories, or particularly once you cross the Russian border. And so this is based on what we do know at this point. The numbers could be even higher than this. I mean, it's really a horrifying phenomenon that we're dealing with. It's a very high priority for our work. It's a high priority for the U.S. government. We're working with a lot of different components in the State Department, the Justice Department, and others to try to verify what the actual numbers are, to develop means of identifying who the individuals are, and trying to look at a way to address this. But we still have a long way to go in this regard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. The chair recognizes Representative Jim Costa from California. Appears we may have some technical problems. We'll come back. Chair recognizes Representative Kathy Manning. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. Mr. Prosecutor General, I believe during your testimony you called for the establishment of a special international tribunal. Am I correct in that? Did you call for the establishment of a special international tribunal?
Yes, thank you. Yes, of course. It's not only because of my position. It's not only because of legal constraints of the jurisdiction of the ICC. It's the position of every Ukrainian, since the crime of aggression should be prosecuted and punished. The crime of aggression, which is the mother of all other war crimes committed by Russians in Ukraine, should be prosecuted and punished. And the only way is to punish the crime of aggression, which is committed by the highest political and military leadership of Russian Federation, is to establish a special tribunal. I will name here, if you allow, historically, when the idea of tribunal appeared, it was the end of February this year. And the first name of this tribunal, as people say, was Kharkiv Tribunal, when residential buildings of Kharkiv were hit by Russian missiles. Then people start to name it Mariupol Tribunal, then Bucha Tribunal. After mass atrocities, we found now Ukrainians are united in the initiative to establish special tribunal to punish the crime of aggression.
Thank you. Mr. Ambassador, you obviously have a wealth of experience in this area. So could you talk to us about what would it take to establish a special tribunal? What could a special tribunal do that currently cannot be done by the Prosecutor General in his offices or by the ICC?
I understand the policy and legal arguments for creation of additional tribunal, and I think they're very compelling. There are a lot of practical difficulties to doing this. One of the usual mechanism by which courts have been established, international courts have been established, is through the United Nations. So there is the possibility of garnering support in the General Assembly possibly getting a vote there that's in favor of creating a tribunal. The challenge will then be in implementation, and particularly when you have 2 permanent 5 members of the Security Council adamantly opposed to this. And it just becomes a challenge for the Secretariat of the UN to then implement something, even if you have support in the General Assembly. Likewise, for some sort of alternative process, whether it's in the European Union or the Council of Europe, it does require consensus, generally. In the European Union right now, I think that would be difficult to achieve. Council of Europe also may be challenging. So what is left is probably some sort of process that would involve a consortium of interested states that would be willing to do this. And the challenge there is to do it in a way that has international legitimacy, that it does not look like, you know, a small number of states that's doing this. So I mean, these are the difficulties. With a number of the traditional large donors that support international courts, almost all of them, with the exception of the United States, is a state party to the International Criminal Court. So many of them make the argument we're already supporting an international process through the ICC, and they've been reluctant to do this otherwise. So it's not to say that these challenges are insurmountable. And I certainly understand the strong interest in Ukraine to advance these processes. We're going to work with them. We're going to certainly do what we can to further the process of accountability, however that can best be achieved. But I think we do have to be realistic that these are going to be huge obstacles.
Thank you. What was the mechanism that was used to set up the Nuremberg trials?
The Nuremberg trials, this was done by the allied governments, initially the big 3 governments, the UK, the United States, and the Soviet Union, was agreed in these meetings between Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill that there would be an international process. And then it was created at the end of the war with judges from all of these countries involved.
Thank you. I yield back.
Well, thank you, Representative. Somehow we managed to get this done in between roll calls, but we have a few minutes where I would just like to take any conclusion I had and give you the opportunity, all 3 of you. I was a prosecutor before I came to Congress. I worked with victims and their families when they were subject to murder, rape, terrible crimes. And I just want, we all say and we all believe sincerely that democracy is under attack here. Could you take 1 minute or 2 just for your conclusion and go over the importance to the victims and their families? These are mothers who've seen their daughters raped. These are spouses who've seen their spouses killed, tortured, family members. And in Russia, for these crimes, it appears highly unlikely that any of them will be brought to justice. But in Ukraine, because of your efforts, they will. Could you comment on the importance to the victims' families and the victims themselves that have survived in a democracy, the importance of rule of law? That's what we're fighting for. That's what tens of thousands of Ukrainians have lost their lives for. They've lost their homes. They've lost cities that they can perhaps never come back to. With all that at stake, if you could just sum up from your own personal experiences, just how important it is to the victims' families in a democratic country to make sure that there's accountability and justice.
I believe that all Ukraine and all of Ukrainians are victims of Russian aggression, of war crimes, of genocide, and full So the policy of ignoring Ukraine as a state and ignoring Ukrainians as a nation. All of Ukrainians are victims, and all of Ukrainians are witnesses. And those of Ukrainians who physically and mentally and psychologically suffered, we should do our best to bring them justice, because they need to receive this justice as soon as possible. And for that, for the sake of justice, we all together, as I said, shoulder by shoulder, need to do our job to make Russian perpetrators accountable in Ukraine, on international level, and whatever. And once again, all of the Ukrainians are victims and witnesses of what Russian army and Russian political leadership committed in Ukraine. And one more signal. When we talk about compensation mechanism, we all understand that people, victims of war crimes, who suffered physically, mentally, or psychologically, and relatives who lost their families, they will be included into this mechanism to receive fair compensation, if it could be fair, but compensation, additional compensation for what they suffer from funds of Russia and its oligarchs. This is our strong position.
Ambassador?
As I said earlier, I've been doing this for 30 years. I've been in conflicts all over the world. What struck me when I first went out, just days after the war started, was the scenes at the border, which were actually quite orderly. I was on the Polish border. Poland was doing an amazing job of taking in people from Ukraine. But you immediately notice, because Ukraine had wanted all the men to stay in the country, to be in a position to fight, that you're seeing thousands and thousands of people, and they're all women, children, and the elderly. And just the senselessness of all of this. I mean, when you talk to people, when I would speak to Ukrainians, they talked about just how normal life was a day before this all happened. They were taking their children to soccer practice, going to restaurants, going to family gatherings, and overnight they were forced to gather their belongings and flee their country. For what? For no reason whatsoever. Many have now come back, of course, and the resistance of the Ukrainian people is truly inspiring. But because this is so senseless, because it's so unwarranted, it's critical that we pursue justice. And it may take years, but as you, Chairman Keating, said, we have a unique opportunity here to gather evidence in real time, to build these cases, and to lay the foundations for this justice. It's not going to happen overnight. It may take years to achieve, but we have to do this. We have to be committed to this. Our Ukrainian counterparts are certainly committed to this, and I think those of us in the international community have to do everything we can to support them.
Ms. Matviichuk, do you have any closing comment in that regard?
I worked with people directly, and I know for sure that they need to restore not only their broken lives, broken family, broken vision of future, but their broken belief that the justice is possible, even though delay in time. And when we speak about enormous amount of crimes which Ukraine face, We have to speak not only about consultancy and international expert assistance, it's very crucial and important, but about qualified working hands who are working directly on the ground. Because some things Ukraine couldn't do, not because we don't know what has to be done, but because we have no capacity. And I think that our task has to be not to make a priorities and select cases, but to provide justice for all victims of war crimes, regardless of different criteria, regardless of who the victims are, the media interest of the case, the type and level of cruelty of the war crimes, etc. And I know it from relatives of victims of war crimes. I can make you example. It's a very visible case because it was the first trial against Russian soldier Vadim Shishmarin, who was convicted that he killed unarmed civilian. It was a 62 years old farmer, and I heard his wife, Katerina. He told that, yes, her husband is ordinary farmer, but it's a whole universe for her. And this is a justice that we have to provide, the justice for all people, not only select them for some criteria. And in order to do it, we need to strengthen the national system and also to create additional international mechanism like international tribunal. And last but not the least, it was several discussion about Nuremberg Tribunal. And I will remind that when we speak about Nuremberg, it was a very crucial step in last century when civilized world established the tribunal in order to hold accountable war criminals of regime who had collapsed. But now we are in a new century, and we have to make a significant step forward. Justice must not be dependent from the magnitude of the Putin regime. We shouldn't wait. We must establish the international tribunal and hold Putin and other war criminals accountable without waiting when the regime will fall. And I think that jointly, we can break this circle of impunity and provide justice for whole victims of war crimes which Russia committed in Ukraine.
Thank you. In February, just days before the aggression started, I spoke with the mayor of Kyiv, Vitaly Klitschko, and very emotionally he said, as he was heading back home to his city, thinking that they were going to be attacked any moment, he said, all white people want is to get up in the morning, to hug their children, to have breakfast together, to go to work, to come home, and live in peace. And you can live in a democracy, but if a democracy does not have a rule of law, it's not a democracy. And if a rule of law isn't enforced or can't be enforced, you don't have a rule of law. So your work is essential. We can win on the battlefield and lose unless we defend in every day our democracy. Thank you for your tireless efforts in this regard. It's important. It's one more battlefield that we have to win on, and you're an inspiration to every lover of freedom and democracy in the world. With that, the members of the committee will have 5 days to submit statements, extraneous material, and questions for the record, subject to the rules and limitation of this committee. I thank you again for such an important hearing, and with that, this hearing is adjourned.